Hey, Matt, welcome to Easy Conversations. Thank you for joining me today. I'm looking forward to our discussion. We've been able to talk offline, and there's a lot of similarities around how we look at supporting people, especially in the therapeutic standpoint, and especially in the world we find ourselves in today, where lifestyle choices are so significant in affecting our mental health, but then also a lot more difficult than what you could have looked at even 100 years ago, right? A lot has changed, obviously, in the last few decades, which can complicate things as well. Before we jump into all of that, I did want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what are you doing in your current chapter of life?
Sure, sure. Thank you. I'm excited to speak with you. I really enjoy your podcast, and yeah, it's fun honor to be here with you. My name's Matt Campbell. I'm a psychologist. I've been in private practice for 23 years, father of four, and the current chapter of life is boys getting older and moving on to their independence, and work remains fulfilling, something that has just been of increasing meaning to me in
Mhm.
my work and in my life myself, and something that I really try to work on with my clients as well as
Mhm.
in life.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that. And you've been doing it for a while. So, how have you continued to find that sense of purpose and meaning? Has it evolved over time? I'm sure as you've gone through different phases of life and as you're sharing your children getting older too, how has this whole work piece found fulfillment in its own way, right? How has it evolved for you?
I think that it is something that has always been of such value and importance. I grew up in a very caregiving, a very socially conscious family. And to the extent of now, I have a 91-year-old mother who still volunteers for a community organization for those in need. And so it's always been such a meaningful part of my life. People are endlessly fascinating. We are just
Mhm.
really interesting beings. And to be invited into people's experience, it's always been an honor and remains just a real honor, something that is incredibly meaningful regardless of my stage in life. So it's just such
Mhm.
full work.
Absolutely. And you seem very grounded and calm. So, what are some things that you do for yourself, right? Because I find sometimes, especially when you're listening to some heavy stuff and you have to kind of step away and process it for yourself. So, I have my own practice around that. I make sure I get enough time outside or I'm exercising. Nature is definitely huge for me, but being in Canada, that can be tricky for half the year, if not more. So there are other ways I have to fill that cup. But how do you do it for yourself? What keeps you grounded? And how do you separate the heaviness of what this type of work can bring? A lot of people ask me that too. They're like, how do you take care of yourself when you're listening to these things? And I have my own process. I have certain rules at home too that I don't necessarily talk about work, but that can also have its own sets of challenges. But yeah, just wanted to hear your approach to it.
I've what I have found is much like yourself, having routine and having
Mhm.
a consistent practice and schedule of getting outside, moving, being with people I love. That is very grounding, so important in my life. And I think that's probably a universal question that people
Mhm.
that do what you and I do are asked. And I think that those boundaries are so essential, so very
Mhm.
essential. And there will be times where you're working with people that it's more intense. And those are
Mhm.
times that I find that I really have to be conscious of engaging in my life and engaging in nature and the very foundational self-care aspects, and also to give myself that room to be exhausted or need
Mm.
some downtime, sometimes even very superficial things to de-stress, distract. Those can be really beneficial at certain times more than others.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to bring in, because over time, it sounds like you've developed a bit of a system that you like to share with clients. And what I'm hearing based on our previous conversation too, a lot of it is something you practice yourself. So it makes it that much easier to talk about, right? I think that was the biggest thing I learned stepping into this field is if I'm going to be suggesting certain things for clients to consider, then I need to be practicing that too, even though it makes sense. But if I'm not practicing it, to me, it doesn't feel authentic and it may not feel authentic to the other person. What are these systems or this system that you've developed? And can you share some insight into what allowed you to categorize things into 5 different areas based on what you were seeing?
Sure. What happened for me in terms of my work is that I think that we can go so deep and get things can be so deep in this work and in our own lives, our own introspective times that can be so deep. As
Mhm.
I worked with people over the years in doing this kind of work, I kept finding that there was this part of our existence, of our lives, that doesn't get nearly the focus that it deserves. I think that I think sometimes in work, in therapy and in psychology, I think sometimes we want to help with really smart interpretations. And I think that there's that
Yeah.
ego that can get involved where we want to really intensely help and we want to let people know how deeply we're understanding what they're saying and such. And I think
Mm.
maybe what we need to start with has to do with taking care of our basic foundations. I don't know if you ever have seen it, the nail on the head video. There's this great video where you have two
Mhm.
people, man and a woman, and the woman is talking about this distress and this headache and how difficult it is and such. And that's when the camera is panning behind her, and then they switch it to the other side, and the guy says, "There, there's a nail in your head." And she's like, "You're just trying to you're always about answering problem solving and all this stuff." And he's like, "I get it, but there's a nail in your head." And I love that. And it really, to me, resonates with what these 5 things are that I talk
Mm.
about, our primal 5 and these kind of things, because you had a guest, I don't know if it was a month or 2 ago, that was an author and was talking about several of these things, and they were talking about
Mm.
how they've had these people in longevity who talk about, like I said, a number of these things, and I think the gentleman said he couldn't include it in the film because it was too boring, which I think is
Yeah.
something that we run into, is that we don't recognize and value these things adequately. And those things being getting outdoors, getting sleep, moving our bodies, having meaningful connection, and being really conscious with what we physically and mentally consume. These are
Mm.
things that are just so fundamental to our existence, and they're not sexy and they're not fascinating, but they are conversely really the most important things for us to do.
Yeah, absolutely, and I appreciate that because to your point, it can be so mundane and then it doesn't have the same impact. Now, one of the things I see, because as you're sharing, it's not the over it's not like over the top type of solution. So when you're talking to people about, hey, maybe think about improving your sleep, maybe think about exercising more. sometimes that can be met with like resistance because I've got this mental health issue. Why am I here talking about my sleep and my exercise routine? How do you confront those types of situations where, let's be honest, someone might say, I'm paying a couple $100 here and this is the solution you're offering me?
When someone is looking for something deeper, and I talk about these basic foundations, it's really important to provide the reasoning for that. It's really important to explain that our bodies have remained the same
Mm,
over a great period of time. We live in a world that is so different and that has not changed the needs of our bodies. Our ancestors had no choice to survive, but to do these things. So, consequently, if we're not taking care of the basics, then we don't have a foundation to build upon. And we're really just trying to figure out a way to balance things on a shaky foundation until those things are taken care of. And in fact, sometimes these things can, in and of themselves, take care of so much distress that we experience. We know that exercise is found to be generally equivalent to antidepressants. We know the impact of sunlight on mood and sleep, and we know how sleep helps us with emotional regulation, how meaningful
mm,
connection we live in a culture. There's a white paper on loneliness. It's a real epidemic in our
mhm,
world. And so when we can create a more solid foundation, not only are we more able to work on things that we see as deeper and many times more compelling, but
mm.
also in and of itself, sometimes it can take care of a great amount of our distress.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'm hearing is going back to the foundational stuff, like you said, why has it become so difficult for people to not realize that, right? So, a lot of the things you're talking about, you made reference to a previous episode from this podcast around how simple it is that it's not even worth talking about because it's
Right.
not going to get people excited. So, where's the gap, right? And I'm just asking this as someone, let's just say, if someone from outside of the mental health world was
Mhm.
wondering, because I agree with everything you're sharing. And that is a lot of my focus too. And it's something I've continued to apply in my life. Just to share a bit more, I was talking to my wife last night too, and we were talking about social media use. And I was explaining to her every 2 days, I'll just go on Instagram, I'll make a post about the podcast, and I'll delete the app right away. And then when I need to, I'll reinstall it, go on, do my thing, and get off again, delete it. And I was sharing that with her about all my other social media apps. So I could see the impact it's having on me, but what's preventing people from recognizing that and making these lifestyle choices that we're touching on here?
I'm not sure that people
Hmm.
don't realize many of these things, but I think that they are so well done and they
Mm,
prey upon these human tendencies, primarily the maximize pleasure and minimize pain, the short-term
mm,
gratification aspects. And it's really a challenge for us in that regard
yes.
that we can get, it's essentially sugar. All of these things are
Mm,
sugar and they give us these dopamine bursts and they give us the immediate gratification. And what is what we're trying to encourage is more of a meat and potatoes type of approach. And we're dealing with a sugar society. We're dealing with, if you want
mm,
to feel better right now, here is this, whether it's a food or it's a drink or it's a chemical or it's a reel or
mm,
it's scrolling through these things. It's just this immediacy of
mm.
enjoyment or distraction that
Yes.
that people are dealing with. So I think so often, I think that most people would recognize when I speak with people And part of my intake is to go through these things. I just find them so important
Mm,
now. Go through them in that initial appointment with people. And I've noticed more and more that when I get to my question about talk to me about media, talk to me about, do you feel like you're negatively impacted by the news or social media? And many times it's just this knowing laugh that's almost indicating, aren't we all? There is a
yeah.
real recognition of this, but I think that I use casinos used to be the example of where psychological factors, psychological research was used most effectively to influence our behavior, pumping in oxygen, the
Mm,
noises, the drinks, all these things that would
mhm,
keep people at the tables and keep giving away their money.
mm,
These other things, they're casinos on steroids, social media
yeah.
platforms, all these, they have got us down. And so that's what we're up against. And food is not
Yes.
dissimilar in terms of
Mm,
it's just for our ancestors, we're wired in such a way that for our ancestors, sugar was a treat. Sugar gives that
mhm,
short-term burst when it's that's the reward system. We're not made like we were made for it to be in short supply. And now it's in basically
right.
every processed food is there so much sugar
Yes.
because of that reinforcement reward loop to keep us buying it and to keep us after it. And that social
Mhm,
media is essential. In the workbook, we call it junk, avoiding
mm,
junk. And that's mental and physical junk. And I feel like that's
mhm.
so much of what we're up against. And
Yes.
we're up against a convenient society.
Mm,
We talk about social connection. I can go online and I can order my groceries and have them delivered. I don't even
right.
need, our ancestors had to go hunt, fish, farm. I don't even have to go out of my house to get a bounty
Right.
of food. It's just not the way we were made. And we're going
Yeah.
to experience the consequences of that.
We already are, right? If you look
Right.
at some of the things we're touching on, for sure. It's interesting, even with casinos, like if anyone's been to Vegas, I've just observed, right? It's so hard to get out. And
Yeah.
it's things are dark, there's no windows, so you don't even know what time of day it is.
Right.
And you can easily get lost in one casino or from one building to another and still be there. And
Yeah.
you can make the case that not to pick only on social media, but that's similar design as you were alluding to. But the other thing, to put the social media piece aside as well, another thing that you touched on is like, again, coming back to lifestyle choices with the way work is designed nowadays, and maybe it is because of the industrial revolution, but we are staying inside, we're not getting out. And now, with everything being so digitized, we're still connected, even in the workspace, right? You can be answering emails after your hours are done. You're still connected, you're staying inside. In some cases, you're not having an access to a window. There's not a lot of natural light. So, again, all of that starts to add up. And I think the pandemic was a good shift in a way for many people. They realized that, hey, I can do my job from home where I can have a little bit more flexibility, maybe get out, do some yard work or whatever, but get some natural light, get some fresh air, which is often a challenge in those work settings.
Sure. Sure. And I think
Yeah.
what it's interesting you mentioned the pandemic because I think these things are so connected to one another. I think that the pandemic, I think that the flip side of that is I think for many people, the very nature of the social distancing is I think that it
Mm,
did probably exacerbate loneliness. I think that with
yes.
all these different platforms for connection and so on and so forth that just don't meet the need of a human
Mm,
of being in the presence of one another. And the way I view meaningful connection, the connection we need, is when the connection is the end. In other words, I am with this person or I'm with these people because they are the reason for being here, as opposed to a means to an
mm,
end, that I'm doing this for a purpose. Like this is going to get me to another place or access to something. That's not the kind of connection I think is the meaningful type that we're made for. I think we're made for
Yes.
those times where it is the end, it is the purpose, is to be in the presence with this person.
And a lot of the things you're touching on, one can make changes on an individual level, right? Again, the lifestyle choices. But the connection piece, I think personally, I just want to spend a bit more time exploring this because that I see to be a huge challenge for many people that I talk to because maybe they've got strained relationships with family members, maybe they're having challenges within their relationship, and then sometimes finding friends where it's like, oh, I don't know how to connect with people. We don't have a lot in common. And again, it's easier to isolate and not confront your own views or your choices, or even stepping into the discomfort of putting yourself out there, perhaps feeling a little bit awkward, trying to make new friends, especially if you're a little bit older. So there's a lot of those issues I see arise, especially around forming connections. How do you navigate that? And what are some pieces of advice you offer or suggestions around helping yourself build connections if you're really struggling in that sense, or you're really having a hard go at meeting people or connecting and reaching out to people that you already have in your life?
Sure. I think that I would start with one of the words that you just used that I think is so
Mhm.
fundamentally important, whether it is social connection or really anything where we're seeking growth and improvement. And that is that part of behavior change, to do so, we need to accept that discomfort is part of the process. And we don't like that. That's not meant to trivialize or minimize that experience or to bravado. It's just the recognition that change will inevitably involve discomfort. Healthy change, all sorts of things will involve discomfort. I often use the example of if you go to a gym and you walk out of the gym feeling exactly like you did when you walked into the gym, what does that tell you? Of course, it tells you probably didn't do a whole lot because
Mhm.
that shortness of breath or muscle fatigue or sweat is an indication that you pushed your body to something that stressed it, that created discomfort, and that discomfort is how growth, how fitness, how strength occurs. It's the same thing in other areas of our life, and certainly
Mhm.
in the work that you and I do, is that we can't interpret discomfort as something is the matter. That is where the growth occurs. And so when I talk to clients in terms of the social, of course, we have the basics, right? Frequency and proximity. The more we're around people, the more frequently we're around people, the more likely we are to have those connections. So much of it is just putting ourselves in places where the opportunity is increased, finding groups of people that may share some similar interests. That is really important. And sometimes it can
Mhm.
also be something where we volunteer and we find that engagement with others. And so certainly it can be sometimes a trap when we focus on I have this strained relationship. And it's the
Mm.
I think sometimes the onus, the focus can become so much on that one relationship rather than just more generally having human connection.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think it's you have to sometimes even challenge yourself to look at other ways than what you're used to, because that is also part of the discomfort, right? Putting yourself out there in different ways, whether it's joining a club, maybe it's, I know here where I live, a lot of people will find a meetup group just to go for a hike And then
Mhm.
over time, you meet a bunch of strangers and you connect, right? And that can be,
Right.
you're killing many things with one stone, right? You're getting out, you're in nature, and you're also creating social connections. So I think things like that, they're all around us. Sometimes we just have to make the effort of looking. Now, the other thing you talked about, and you talked about consumption and you touched on
Mhm.
physical consumption. I think, again, very easy to get our head around, right? Food, obviously, you made reference to sugar, processed food, all of that can affect our health, which can then also affect our mental health. But beyond physical consumption, it's also what we consume through our eyes and our ears. I'm a big proponent of that. I know a few years ago, I made a conscious choice around the music I was listening to, and that I felt created a big shift for me. But
Yeah.
how do people get their head around this notion of consumption goes beyond what I'm putting into my body through my mouth, but it's also through other forms of my senses?
I love that. I love that example with the music. I can very much, in fact, maybe I need to think about that myself a little bit. I find that my music is often reflective of my mood, which isn't always the best thing. But I agree with you in terms of these different sensory aspects. And to give an example of this, one of the things that I've been excited to see out there more and more, maybe it's also a sign of the
Mhm.
times, unfortunately, but news consumption. And that is
Mm,
something that is so profoundly important. And if, again, if we get back to the ancestral evolutionary aspects, the human was not made for constant news consumption. We weren't made to know every
mhm,
tragedy that has occurred in the world. It's overwhelming to get all of this news all the time. Our ancestors would know, I would imagine, what was going on in their village and maybe some surrounding villages. But these days, we know what's going on basically everywhere. And so when we
mhm,
talk about it in terms of our consumption is our fuel, our consumption is what fuels us.
mm,
And so I think about clients I've worked with that, for example, what is news media going to touch on? It's going to get to the primal aspects of us. It's going to focus on death. It's going to focus on sex, procreation. It's going to focus on outrage because that's what is going to get eyeballs or clicks on their media.
mhm.
And I think about anxious clients that dealt with so much anxiety and they would watch the news. Here's the thing, if I am fearful of someone breaking into my home, then I'm going to pay special attention to the news that I'm getting about burglaries or violent crime, and the news is not going to give me information about the 99.999% of people who went home that night, had dinner, watched a show, and went to bed. That's not newsworthy. And so we're
Yeah.
inundated with the
Yep.
exception, the rare events. But the more we're inundated with it, the more we think that's the norm, the more likely it is. And
Mm,
I've worked with numerous clients who that was the case for. Or if I'm fearful of flying, the news is not going to go over the hundreds of thousands of safe flights. It's if there's a tragedy, that's what we're going to hear. So that just exacerbates that perception
mm,
of danger. But that's just the way our brains are. What we're exposed to is what we're going to
mm.
perceive is reality and is the likelihood. So that is our fuel. What we mentally and physically consume is our fuel.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of research if people are interested to look into social psychology and everything you're touching on when it comes to the news and what gets people's eyeballs on it, right? So there's not a lot of good stories that are being told because people are not going to tune into that. It is preying on the emotional reaction, and especially around fear. I feel like a lot of the times it is based on fear. Even some of the things you're touching on, whether it's death or some other crime, it creates this sense of fear which people respond to. And it's interesting too now, as you were sharing that, I was thinking about growing up, we had TVs, right? And you actually go to the channel that you want to watch. So you're consciously picking something that you want to watch.
Mhm.
Whereas now, where everything is driven by an algorithm, you just go to the medium and you get the information that you've perhaps
Sure.
trained the algorithm to give you. So your agency is minimized in that sense. And this is where people talk about falling into that echo chamber and not being able to get out because you've trained the system to keep feeding you the information that you've been seeking. And now you don't even know what's different, right? And I think that's also affected people's worldviews, how they see things, and the opinions they're forming. And I feel like some of that critical thinking is going away too, which is the point I'm trying to make is it's creating further separation as opposed to bringing us together.
Absolutely, absolutely. It makes us forget how similar we all are. It makes us
Yes.
lose sight of that makes us lose sight of the fact that the vast majority of things that we believe in and value and find important are similar. And you said it's the echo chamber undoubtedly. And then there's also, is it even real? Is it even
Mhm.
accurate? Is what we're consuming close to a truth? Or is it simply, as you said, to evoke emotion? That's for myself, I really needed to be intentional about what news I did consume, and so I have a few sources that I think are pretty moderate and very what I grew up with as the news, which was facts,
Yeah.
or as
Yes.
close to facts as I guess we ever get, but was just
Right.
information, was providing
Mm.
information on events and such. And then I was actually
Mhm.
allowed to have critical thinking skills and have an opinion on things and didn't have to be told what to think as we're inundated with these days. So that's what I did. I went out and found different information sources and get an email in the morning and really try to limit the amount of time on with news sources. My rule of
Mhm.
thumb, my encouragement to people is if you get 15 minutes of news in the morning and 15 minutes in the late afternoon, you've got what you need. Then
Yeah.
nothing more than that could be needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the main point that's coming out is just having a bit of listening to what you're consuming, but then having that critical ear around it, right? That not taking it all in, but saying, "Yeah, okay, this is just information. I don't need to run with this and make decisions based on this or form opinions on it. It's someone's view and I can just look at it from that side, right? As opposed to just internalizing it. But like you said, going out and looking at for multiple sources of information so you feel like you have a broad perspective on things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I think
Mhm.
the way I think of it is every good lie has elements of truth. Otherwise, it's not a good lie. If you can't rely
Right.
on one or two things to pin it on and then build something around it, and we can really help ourselves with that if we have multiple things that we look to provide us information so that there's not just one thing. We're not so vulnerable to our emotions being manipulated.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another thing you had shared at the beginning I wanted to come back to, especially in the therapeutic sense. And what was coming up for me was this perception of deeply understanding what the other person might be going through. And
Mhm.
I think sometimes that can be a bit performative too. But one thing I try to remind myself is even though I have lived experience, it's okay if I don't understand and I can put that out there rather than trying to give the impression that I do or getting that validation myself that I do understand. How do you grapple with that? And what would your advice be to someone who's newer in the field in trying to make sense of that? Because obviously, when you're seeing people, you want to build rapport, you want to build trust, but that could easily be eroded if you give a false perception too, right? So how do you teeter totter on that line of ensuring that you're being empathetic, but also being honest that this does something I don't necessarily understand, but I'm happy to walk this walk with you and grow with you as well.
One of the things that has been such a powerful experience and learning process that I have had, and it's really quite liberating, is to realize I don't need to know and understand everything. I can actually work with my client. I can actually let them explain things to me more and ask them more questions or acknowledge not understanding something fully. And
Mm,
not only have I found that I can do that, I've found that people respond really so often to those questions, to my acknowledgement that I don't think I'm really fully getting it. And could they tell me more
mm,
or these types of things? Because implicit within that is that I want to understand it better. Implicit in that is that I am here with you and we are engaged. And what you're saying is so important that I really want to understand it. And so I actually think it's rapport building in for the majority of my experience. People people are very responsive that I have found to
mm,
simply not needing to know everything. As you said, not being performative, but being actually a human that's present, who's willing to say, I want to understand more. Can you tell me more? I don't think I'm getting it.
yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate that because it ties everything together around what we're talking about. Because while we're speaking about this sense of being performative in a clinical setting, you can make the case that we can even do that in our social connections, right? And everything we've touched on, especially over the consumption of news,
Mhm.
forming opinions, and then often that can get in the way of our social connections. I think what I'm hearing from you is having that humility that you don't need to have all the answers, which opens you up to other people's perspective, which brings us together, right? I
Mhm.
think what I've found over the last few years is if I can sit there and listen to someone's story and not judge it, not question it, just hear it out and understand, okay, this person went through this experience while mine can be different. That's okay. And in those interactions, I find there is growth in that connection. So I think it's worth emphasizing that this approach doesn't necessarily only have to be in a clinical setting, it can also extend to our social connections.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that I guess there are a number of different parts to that, but certainly it goes beyond just the clinical. I think it's also wonderful. You said earlier, you had mentioned something about how we can knock out several things together. And I think that when we ourselves, rather than as clinicians, but just as people, when we do these things and we are connected with others, and particularly when we're connected with others and doing these healthy things, the benefits multiply. And when we have that community and a healthy community, because that's also one of the things that with these foundational aspects that's a challenge is that when the people who are around aren't so healthy, it's more challenging
Yes.
to make healthy choices ourselves. And so when we can find that, it's just profoundly healthy emotionally as well as, of course, physically.
Yes, absolutely. So, what are some, we've touched on the foundational pieces that you work with. We've
Mhm.
definitely spent time talking about social connections and the importance of that, and then factoring that in with our consumption of things, not only food. But what are some key takeaways that you would like to share with the audience that they can immediately pick up and work on that could help them at least improve certain areas of their life right? Assuming that it may be relevant for them. But yeah, what are some key things that, from your perspective, are quick wins, low hanging fruit that we can all think about?
I think really in terms of takeaways, I think it's so many things. It really begins with awareness. It really
Mm,
begins with attending to these different areas of our life and getting a sense of where we are with them. Oftentimes, we are so accustomed to depletion, to mental and physical depletion, that it's just our normal. And we're really not noticing these different areas and aspects. We don't, sometimes we don't even have the experience of what it could be like, of just how powerful these things can be when we're taking care of them. So I think it begins with that. I think that in terms of these 5 areas that we've mentioned, I think maybe the quickest win we can have is when we get up, maybe we have a coffee in the morning. If we step
mm,
outside, if we have a porch or a chair outside or something, that is good to just sit there and enjoy it and spend that 15 minutes outside and getting that habit regularly. Morning sunlight, it's so powerful. It's so
mm,
powerful. We are setting the circadian rhythm. We are helping ourselves with mood. We are ourselves with sleep at night because the circadian rhythm it's getting consistent. It's getting our body is getting the information. This is daytime. And so we're awake. I think
mhm,
that's a really quick win. I will say it from my experience in working with people, social connection is the one that has the quickest payoff.
mm,
That is my experience. I think that as profoundly as important as our sleep is, for example, I think that is it's often something we really experience the benefits the more consistent we are with it over time.
mhm.
Social connection in the folks that I work with, my clients, that's the one that I notice the quickest benefit in terms of mood, in terms of emotional functioning, in terms of feeling a sense of meaning and value and purpose. That is really one that has impressed me in
Mm,
terms of how quickly that can improve our lives, quality of our
yeah,
lives.
yes. And even within that, I know you touched on not just any social connection, right? We have to be mindful of the quality, not to judge people in the sense that, but just being aware of who am I spending my time with? Are they, I often ask not only myself that question, but people that I work with too. Is this person serving you or is this person bringing you down?
Right.
And there can be boundaries in that space too, or there can be conversations that need to be had. But at
Mhm.
some point, you have to make the decision, what is this connection serving? Like, how is it serving me? And so just being able to discern as well, right? The type of social connection, because not all are good, as you were sharing earlier.
The metaphor we use in the workbook is the similarity to a garden. And what we're
Mm,
wanting is we're wanting to grow and we're wanting to nurture those things that we value and that bring us joy. And weeds grow easily. Weeds grow easily. We don't need to do
yeah.
much for that, but it's not what we need. It's not what we're wanting.
Mm,
And so I think that the work that you just described about being aware and really thinking and taking stock of how do I feel when I'm in the presence of this person or these people? And how do I feel afterwards? Maybe even how do I feel in anticipation and preparation of being with them? And I think that can tell us a lot, whether it's energy providing or energy depleting. These are things that are really good to be aware of. And again, just that
yes.
idea that being with is the purpose. That's what I'm doing it for.
Yeah. Absolutely. Awareness piece is so important because I think one of the things I notice sometimes clients can be so disappointed or discouraged when they feel like they're not making the changes that they would like to see, or that the results aren't there. But I often have to remind them that, hey, the awareness is there, which wasn't there before. Now that's there, you can catch yourself
Right.
and start slowly making those changes, right? And I think sometimes we minimize the value and the impact awareness alone can have. And not to like just settle on the, hey, I have awareness now and I'm good, but
Right.
truly taking action with the awareness. But the awareness is huge, and not to lose sight of that
It's
either.
essential. It's an
Mhm.
absolute necessity, and I think that the push that comes from the dissonance between what we know is healthy versus what we're doing, it doesn't exist without awareness,
Yes.
and so it's an absolute
Yeah.
necessity, and I also would say along with that, I think that it can be really limiting. Obviously, perfectionism is very
Mhm.
limiting and really inhibits change, but also just the idea of we're just trying to improve. We're just trying to
Mm.
improve. We're never going to hit everything. We're never going to have the perfect regimen with our diet and with our media and with our sleep. That doesn't exist. And not hitting those is not failure. So long as there's progress, as long as there's a little bit better and a little bit better, that's where it is. That's where it's at.
Mhm.
If we're focused on doing it, on comparing ourselves to others who we perceive to have met to be at these levels and such, then we're really missing it and we're really not helping ourselves. It's just, I'm just a little bit better, but some movement in the right
Mhm.
direction. That's it. That's what we're going for.
Yeah. Yes. Small incremental changes, right? And they add up over time.
And failure. Let
Yeah.
failure happen. I've had times where I've worked with clients, and I remember I was vulnerable to this early in my career. I wanted to feel competent. And I would have someone who would give good feedback and everything was great, and so on and so forth. Then you learn that the trajectory of change is not an upward trajectory without any dips or plateaus or anything like that. That's where change is strengthened, is when we have a
Mhm.
plateau or a dip and we keep moving towards health and
Yes.
what we want. That's where it's strengthened. If it's just an easy upward trajectory, we're probably vulnerable
Yes.
to some recidivism, to moving backwards.
Yes, for sure. Matt, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a joy to speak with you. Sounds like we look at things the same way, and not that is the only way of doing things, but I think it's helpful to understand that things don't have to be overly, we don't have to make drastic changes to enjoy some of the benefits that can come, that we are all supposed to enjoy in life, right? So it's the foundational stuff as you've touched on. So I appreciate you sharing that message as well. Now, for listeners that want to learn more about your work, or if they want to find more ways of getting a hold of you, what are some ways they can do that?
Sure. I have a website
Mhm.
titled Our Primal 5, the number 5, ourprimal5.com. Then we have
Mhm.
an Instagram account with that same handle, and then a LinkedIn under my name, Matthew Campbell, PhD, I believe it has. But absolutely, absolutely a newsletter that's with on the website. But yeah, those are some ways that I can be reached.
Awesome. We'll put all of that in the show notes, but thank you again, Matt. Really appreciate your time today and having this conversation with me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.